Tynan Portillo presents. Featuring the works of Edgar Allan Poe and the best horror stories from the 19th century. Welcome to the Poe Show Podcast. Music and narration by Tynan Portillo. Please see trigger warnings in this episode description. Today's episode, The Oblong Box by Edgar Allan Poe. Some years ago, I engaged passage from Charleston, South Carolina, to the city of New York in the fine packet ship Independence, Captain Hardy. We were to sail on the 15th of the month, June, weather permitting, and on the 14th I went on board to arrange some matters in my stateroom. I found that we were to have a great many passengers, including a more than usual number of ladies. On the list were several of my acquaintances, and among other names, I was rejoiced to see that of Mr. Cornelius Wyatt, a young artist for whom I entertained feelings of warm friendship. He had been with me a fellow student at university, where we were very much together. He had the ordinary temperament of genius, and was a compound of misanthropy, sensibility, and enthusiasm. To these qualities he united the warmest and truest heart which ever beat in a human bosom. I observed that his name was carded upon 3 staterooms, and upon again referring to the list of passengers, I found that he had engaged passage for himself, wife, and 2 sisters, his own. The staterooms were sufficiently roomy, and each had 2 berths, one above the other. These berths, to be sure, were so exceedingly narrow as to be insufficient for more than one person. Still, I could not comprehend why there were 3 staterooms for these 4 persons. I was, just at that epoch, in one of those moody frames of mind which make a man abnormally inquisitive about trifles, and I confess with shame that I busied myself in a variety of ill-bred and preposterous conjectures about this matter of the supernumerary stateroom. It was no business of mine, to be sure, but with none the less pertinacity did I occupy myself in attempts to resolve the enigma. At last, I reached a conclusion which wrought in me great wonder why I had not arrived at it before. "It is a servant, of course," I said. "What a fool I am, not sooner to have thought of so obvious a solution." And then I again repaired to the list, but here I saw distinctly that no servant was to come with the party, although in fact it had been the original design to bring one, for the words "and servant" had been first written and then overscored. "Oh, extra baggage, to be sure," I now said to myself. "Something he wishes not to be put in the hold, something to be kept under his own eye. Ah, I have it. A painting or so, and this is what he has been bargaining about with Nicolino, the Italian Jew." This idea satisfied me, and I dismissed my curiosity for the nonce. Wyatt's 2 sisters I knew very well, and most amiable and clever girls they were. His wife he had newly married, and I had never yet seen her. He had often talked about her in my presence, however, and in his usual style of enthusiasm. He described her as of surpassing beauty, wit, and accomplishment. I was therefore quite anxious to make her acquaintance. On the day in which I visited the ship, the 14th, Wyatt and party were also to visit it, so the captain informed me, and I waited on board an hour longer than I had designed in hope of being presented to the bride. But then an apology came. Mrs. W. was a little indisposed and would decline coming on board until tomorrow, at the hour of sailing. The morrow having arrived, I was going from my hotel to the wharf when Captain Hardy met me and said that, owing to circumstances, a stupid but convenient phrase, he rather thought the Independence would not sail for a day or 2, and that when all was ready, he would send up and let me know. This I thought strange, for there was a stiff southerly breeze. But as the circumstances were not forthcoming, although I pumped for them with much perseverance, I had nothing to do but return home and digest my impatience at leisure. I did not receive the expected message from the captain for nearly a week. It came at length, however, and I immediately went on board. The ship was crowded with passengers, and everything was in the bustle attendant upon making sail. Wyatt's party arrived in about 10 minutes after myself. There were the two sisters, the bride, and the artist, the latter in one of his customary fits of moody misanthropy. I was too well used to these, however, to pay them any special attention. He did not even introduce me to his wife, this courtesy devolving perforce upon his sister Marian, a very sweet and intelligent girl, who in a few hurried words made us acquainted. Mrs. Wyatt had been closely veiled, and when she raised her veil in acknowledging my bow, I confess that I was very profoundly astonished. I should have been much more so, however, had not long experience advised me not to trust with too implicit a reliance the enthusiastic descriptions of my friend the artist when indulging in comments upon the loveliness of woman. When beauty was the theme, I well knew with what facility he soared into the regions of the purely ideal. The truth is, I could not help regarding Mrs. Wyatt as a decidedly plain-looking woman. If not positively ugly, she was not, I think, very far from it. She was dressed, however, in exquisite taste, and then I had no doubt that she had captivated my friend's heart by the more enduring graces of the intellect and soul. She said very few words, and passed at once into her stateroom with Mr. W. My old inquisitiveness now returned. There was no servant. That was a settled point. I looked, therefore, for the extra baggage. After some delay, a cart arrived at the wharf with an oblong pine box, which was everything that seemed to be expected. Immediately upon its arrival, we made sail, and in a short time were safely over the bar and standing out to sea. The box in question was, as I say, oblong. It was about 6 feet in length by 2.5 in breadth. I observed it attentively and liked to be precise. Now this shape was peculiar, and no sooner had I seen it than I took credit to myself for the accuracy of my guessing. I had reached the conclusion, it will be remembered, that the extra baggage of my friend the artist would prove to be pictures, or at least a picture, for I knew he had been for several weeks in conference with Nicolino, and now here was a box which from its shape could possibly contain nothing in the world but a copy of Leonardo's Last Supper. And a copy of this very Last Supper done by Rubini the Younger at Florence I had known for some time to be in the possession of Nicolino. This point, therefore, I considered as sufficiently settled. I chuckled excessively when I thought of my acumen. It was the first time I had ever known Wyatt to keep from me any of his artistical secrets. But here he evidently intended to steal a march upon me and smuggle a fine picture to New York, under my very nose, expecting me to know nothing of the matter. I resolved to quiz him well, now and hereafter. One thing, however, annoyed me not a little. The box did not go into the extra stateroom. It was deposited in Wyatt's own, and there too it remained, occupying very nearly the whole of the floor, no doubt to the exceeding discomfort of the artist and his wife. This the more especially as the tar or paint with which it was lettered in sprawling capitals emitted a strong, disagreeable, and, to my fancy, a peculiarly disgusting odor. On the lid were painted the words, Mrs. Adelaide Curtis, Albany, New York, charge of Cornelius Wyatt, Esquire, this side up, to be handled with care. Now, I was aware that Mrs. Adelaide Curtis of Albany was the artist's wife's mother, but then I looked upon the whole address as a mystification intended especially for myself. I made up my mind, of course, that the box and contents would never get farther north than the studio of my misanthropic friend in Chambers Street, New York. For the first 3 or 4 days, we had fine weather, although the wind was dead ahead, having chopped round to the northward immediately upon our losing sight of the coast. The passengers were consequently in high spirits and disposed to be social. I must except, however, Wyatt and his sisters, who behaved stiffly, and I could not help thinking uncourteously to the rest of the party. Wyatt's conduct I did not so much regard. He was gloomy, even beyond his usual habit. In fact, he was morose. But in him I was prepared for eccentricity. For the sisters, however, I could make no excuse. They secluded themselves in their staterooms during the greater part of the passage, and absolutely refused, although I repeatedly urged them, to hold communication with any person on board. Mrs. Wyatt herself was far more agreeable. That is to say, she was chatty. And to be chatty is no slight recommendation at sea. She became excessively intimate with most of the ladies, and to my profound astonishment, evinced no equivocal disposition to coquette with the men. She amused us all very much. I say amused and scarcely know how to explain myself. The truth is, I soon found that Mrs. W. was far oftener laughed at than with. The gentlemen said little about her, but the ladies in a little while pronounced her a good-hearted thing, rather indifferent-looking, totally uneducated, and decidedly vulgar. The great wonder was how Wyatt had been entrapped into such a match. Wealth was the general solution, but this I knew to be no solution at all. For Wyatt had told me that she neither brought him $1 nor had any expectations from any source whatever. He had married, he said, for love, and for love only, and his bride was far more than worthy of his love. When I thought of these expressions on the part of my friend, I confess that I felt indescribably puzzled. Could it be possible that he was taking leave of his senses? What else could I think? He, so refined, so intellectual, so fastidious, with so exquisite perception of the faulty, and so keen an appreciation of the beautiful. To be sure, the lady seemed especially fond of him, particularly so in his absence, when she made herself ridiculous by frequent quotations of what had been said by her beloved husband, Mr. Wyatt. The word husband seemed forever, to use one of her own delicate expressions, forever on the tip of her tongue. In the meantime, it was observed by all on board that he avoided her in the most pointed manner, and for the most part shut himself up alone in his stateroom, where in fact he might have been said to live altogether, leaving his wife at full liberty to amuse herself as she thought best in the public society of the main cabin. My conclusion, from what I saw and heard, was that the artist, by some unaccountable freak of fate, or perhaps in some fit of enthusiastic and fanciful passion, had been induced to unite himself with a person altogether beneath him, and that the natural result, entire and speedy disgust, had ensued. I pitied him from the bottom of my heart, but could not, for that reason, quite forgive his incommunicativeness in the matter of the Last Supper. For this, I resolved to have my revenge. One day he came upon deck, and taking his arm as had been my wont, I sauntered with him backward and forward. His gloom, however, which I considered quite natural under the circumstances, seemed entirely unabated. He said little, and that moodily and with evident effort. I ventured a jest or two, and he made a sickening attempt at a smile. Poor fellow. As I thought of his wife, I wondered that he could have had heart to put on even the semblance of mirth. At last I ventured a home thrust. I determined to commence a series of covert insinuations or innuendos about the Oblong Box, just to let him perceive gradually that I was not altogether the butt or victim of his little bit of pleasant mystification. My first observation was by way of opening a masked battery. I said something about the peculiar shape of that box, and as I spoke the words, I smiled knowingly, winked, and touched him gently with my forefinger in the ribs. The manner in which Wyatt received this harmless pleasantry convinced me at once that he was mad. At first he stared at me as if he had found it impossible to comprehend the witticism of my remark, but as its point seemed slowly to make its way into his brain, his eyes, in the same proportion, seemed protruding from their sockets. Then he grew very red, then hideously pale. Then, as if highly amused with what I had insinuated, he began a loud and boisterous laugh, which to my astonishment he kept up, with gradually increasing vigor, for 10 minutes or more. In conclusion, he fell flat and heavily upon the deck. When I ran to uplift him, to all appearance, he was dead. I called assistance, and with much difficulty we brought him to himself. Upon reviving, he spoke incoherently for some time. At length we bled him and put him to bed. The next morning he was quite recovered, so far as regarded his mere bodily health. Of his mind I say nothing, of course. I avoided him during the rest of the passage by advice of the captain, who seemed to coincide with me altogether in my views of his insanity, but cautioned me to say nothing on this head to any person on board. Several circumstances occurred immediately after this fit of Wyatt which contributed to heighten the curiosity with which I was already possessed. Among other things, this. I had been nervous, drank too much strong green tea, and slept ill at night. In fact, for 2 nights I could not be properly said to sleep at all. Now, my stateroom opened into the main cabin, or dining room, as did those of all the single men on board. Wyatt's 3 rooms were in the after cabin, which was separated from the main one by a slight sliding door, never locked, even at night. As we were almost constantly on a wind, and the breeze was not a little stiff, the ship heeled to leeward very considerably, and whenever her starboard side was to leeward, the sliding door between the cabins slid open, and so remained, nobody taking the trouble to get up and shut it. But my berth was in such a position that, when my own stateroom door was open, as well as the sliding door in question, and my own door was always open on account of the heat, I could see into the after cabin quite distinctly, and just at that portion of it too, where were situated the staterooms of Mr. Wyatt. Well, during 2 nights, not consecutive, while I lay awake, I clearly saw Mrs. W. about 11 o'clock upon each night steal cautiously from the stateroom of Mr. W. and enter the extra room, where she remained until daybreak, when she was called by her husband and went back. That they were virtually separated was clear. They had separate apartments, no doubt in contemplation of a more permanent divorce. And here, after all, I thought, was the mystery of the extra stateroom. There was another circumstance, too, which interested me much. During the 2 wakeful nights in question, and immediately after the disappearance of Mrs. Wyatt into the extra stateroom, I was attracted by certain singular, cautious, subdued noises in that of her husband. After listening to them for some time with thoughtful attention, I at length succeeded perfectly in translating their import. They were sounds occasioned by the artist in prying open the oblong box by means of a chisel and mallet, the latter being apparently muffled or deadened by some soft woolen or cotton substance in which its head was enveloped. In this manner, I fancied I could distinguish the precise moment when he fairly disengaged the lid. Also that I could determine when he removed it altogether, and when he deposited it upon the lower berth in his room. This latter point I knew, for example, by certain slight taps which the lid made in striking against the wooden edges of the berth as he endeavored to lay it down very gently, there being no room for it on the floor. After this, there was a dead stillness, and I heard nothing more upon either occasion until nearly daybreak. Unless perhaps I may mention a low sobbing or murmuring sound, so very much suppressed as to be nearly inaudible. If indeed the whole of this latter noise were not rather produced by my own imagination. I say it seemed to resemble sobbing or sighing, but of course it could not have been either. I rather think it was a ringing in my own ears. Wyatt, no doubt according to custom, was merely giving the rein to one of his hobbies, indulging in one of his fits of artistic enthusiasm. He had opened his oblong box in order to feast his eyes on the pictorial treasure within. There was nothing in this, however, to make him sob. I repeat, therefore, that it must have been simply a freak of my own fancy, distempered by good Captain Hardy's green tea. Just before dawn, on each of the 2 nights of which I speak, I distinctly heard Mr. Wyatt replace the lid upon the oblong box and force the nails into their old places by means of the muffled mallet. Having done this, he issued from his stateroom fully dressed and proceeded to call Mrs. W. from hers. We had been at sea 7 days, and were now off Cape Hatteras, when there came a tremendously heavy blow from the southwest. We were in a measure prepared for it, however, as the weather had been holding out threats for some time. Everything was made snug, aloe, and aloft, and as the wind steadily freshened, we lay to, at length, under spanker and foretopsail, both double-reefed. In this trim we rode safely enough for 48 hours, the ship proving herself an excellent sea-boat in many respects, and shipping no water of any consequence. At the end of this period, however, the gale had freshened into a hurricane, and our aftersail split into ribbons, bringing us so much in the trough of the water that we shipped several prodigious seas, one immediately after the other. By this accident we lost 3 men overboard with the caboose, and nearly the whole of the larboard bulwarks. Scarcely had we recovered our senses before the foretopsail went into shreds, when we got up a storm staysail, and with this did pretty well for some hours, the ship heading the sea much more steadily than before. The gale still held on, however, and we saw no signs of its abating. The rigging was found to be ill-fitted and greatly strained, and on the 3rd day of the blow, about 5 in the afternoon, our mizzen mast, in a heavy lurch to windward, went by the board. For an hour or more we tried in vain to get rid of it on account of the prodigious rolling of the ship, and before we had succeeded, the carpenter came aft and announced 4 feet of water in the hold. To add to our dilemma, we found the pumps choked and nearly useless. All was now confusion and despair, but an effort was made to lighten the ship by throwing overboard as much of her cargo as could be reached, and by cutting away the 2 masts that remained. This we at last accomplished, but we were still unable to do anything at the pumps, and in the meantime the leak gained on us very fast. At sundown, the gale had sensibly diminished in violence, and as the sea went down with it, we still entertained faint hopes of saving ourselves in the boats. At 8 p.m., the clouds broke away to windward, and we had the advantage of a full moon, a piece of good fortune which served wonderfully to cheer our drooping spirits. After incredible labor, we succeeded, at length, in getting the longboat over the side without material accident, and into this we crowded the whole of the crew and most of the passengers. This party made off immediately, and after undergoing much suffering, finally arrived in safety at Ocracoke Inlet on the 3rd day after the wreck. 14 passengers with the captain remained on board, resolving to trust their fortunes to the jolly boat at the stern. We lowered it without difficulty, although it was only by a miracle that we prevented it from swamping as it touched the water. It contained, when afloat, the captain and his wife, Mr. Wyatt and party, a Mexican officer, wife, 4 children, and myself with a valet. We had no room, of course, for anything except a few positively necessary instruments, some provisions, and the clothes upon our backs. No one had thought of even attempting to save anything more. What must have been the astonishment of all, then, when, having proceeded a few fathoms from the ship, Mr. Wyatt stood up in the stern sheets and coolly demanded of Captain Hardy that the boat should be put back for the purpose of taking in his oblong box. "Sit down, Mr. Wyatt," replied the captain somewhat sternly. "You will capsize us if you do not sit quite still. Our gunwale is almost in the water now." "The box," vociferated Mr. Wyatt, still standing. "The box, I say. Captain Hardy, you cannot, you will not refuse me. Its weight will be but a trifle. It is nothing, mere nothing. By the mother who bore you, for the love of heaven, by your hope of salvation, I implore you to put back for the box." The captain for a moment seemed touched by the earnest appeal of the artist, but he regained his stern composure and merely said, "Mr. Wyatt, you are mad. I cannot listen to you. Sit down, I say, or you will swamp the boat. Stay! Hold him! Seize him! He's about to spring overboard! There, I knew it! He is over!" As the captain said this, Mr. Wyatt in fact sprang from the boat, and as we were yet in the lee of the wreck, succeeded by almost superhuman exertion in getting hold of a rope which hung from the forechains. In another moment he was on board and rushing frantically down into the cabin. In the meantime, we had been swept astern of the ship, and being quite out of her lee, were at the mercy of the tremendous sea which was still running. We made a determined effort to put back, but our little boat was like a feather in the breath of the tempest. We saw at a glance that the doom of the unfortunate artist was sealed. As our distance from the wreck rapidly increased, the madman, for as such only could we regard him, was seen to emerge from the companionway, up which by dint of strength that appeared gigantic, he dragged bodily the oblong box. While we gazed in the extremity of astonishment, he passed rapidly several turns of a 3-inch rope, first around the box, and then around his body. In another instant, both body and box were in the sea, disappearing suddenly, at once and forever. We lingered a while sadly upon our oars, with our eyes riveted upon the spot. At length, we pulled away. The silence remained unbroken for an hour. Finally, I hazarded a remark. "Did you observe, Captain, how suddenly they sank? Was not that an exceedingly singular thing?" I confess that I entertained some feeble hope of his final deliverance, when I saw him lash himself to the box and commit himself to the sea. "They sank as a matter of course, and that like a shot. They will soon rise again, however, but not till the salt melts." "The salt? Hush," said the captain, pointing to the wife and sisters of the deceased. "We must talk of these things at some more appropriate time." We suffered much and made a narrow escape, but fortune befriended us, as well as our mates in the longboat. We landed, in fine, more dead than alive, after 4 days of intense distress upon the beach opposite Roanoke Island. We remained here a week, were not ill-treated by the wreckers, and at length obtained a passage to New York. About a month after the loss of the Independence, I happened to meet Captain Hardy in Broadway. Our conversation turned naturally upon the disaster, and especially upon the sad fate of poor Wyatt. I thus learned the following particulars. The artist had engaged passage for himself, wife, 2 sisters, and a servant. His wife was indeed, as she had been represented, a most lovely and most accomplished woman. On the morning of the 14th of June, the day in which I first visited the ship, the lady suddenly sickened and died. The young husband was frantic with grief, but circumstances imperatively forbade the deferring his voyage to New York. It was necessary to take to her mother the corpse of his adored wife, and on the other hand, the universal prejudice which would prevent his doing so openly was well known. 9/10 of the passengers would have abandoned the ship rather than take passage with a dead body. In this dilemma, Captain Hardy arranged that the corpse, being first partially embalmed and packed with a large quantity of salt in a box of suitable dimensions, should be conveyed on board as merchandise. Nothing was to be said of the lady's decease, and as it was well understood that Mr. Wyatt had engaged passage for his wife, it became necessary that some person should personate her during the voyage. This the deceased lady's maid was easily prevailed on to do. The extra stateroom, originally engaged for this girl during her mistress' life, was now merely retained. In this stateroom, the pseudo-wife slept, of course, every night. In the daytime, she performed to the best of her ability the part of her mistress, whose person, it had been carefully ascertained, was unknown to any of the passengers on board. My own mistake arose, naturally enough, through too careless, too inquisitive, and too impulsive a temperament. But of late, it is a rare thing that I sleep soundly at night. There is a countenance which haunts me, turn as I will. There is an hysterical laugh which will forever ring within my ears. Be sure to give this podcast a good rating and subscribe for more on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. You'll find me making tons of content based on Edgar Allan Poe on TikTok and reviewing Poe film adaptations on YouTube. Links in the description. Also, leave a comment for a classic horror story you'd like to hear on the show, or you can use the text the show link to send an anonymous message. You could request an Edgar Allan Poe story or a Victorian ghost story, or if you're an author who'd like to feature your own story on the show, then email me at poeshowpod@gmail.com with your story and details. And if you're in need of a narrator, voice actor, or singer, I've got over 18 years of experience in this field and would love to work with you. I am very glad to have this episode done. I was planning on getting it out much sooner than this, actually, but I caught a terrible sickness. I don't know if it was a cold or what, but I lost my voice and couldn't talk or sing or anything for way too long. So I thank you for your patience, and like I said, I'm so happy to get back to making more stories. The Oblong Box was published in 1844. 3 years before Edgar Allan Poe's wife and cousin, Virginia Eliza Clem, would die, and 5 years before Edgar himself would die. Before its publication, Edgar Allan Poe had taken his own journey via steamboat to New York. Along with that trip, this story may have been inspired by a famous story of the time in New York. In 1842, John C. Colt, brother of Samuel Colt, who invented the Colt revolver, was convicted of murdering a printer named Samuel Adams. In order to hide the body, John had stuffed his victim into a crate, covered the corpse with salt, then boxed it up to be shipped to New Orleans. As Mark Twain once said, "Truth is stranger than fiction, but it is because fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities. Truth isn't." The Oblong Box is very close to being a detective story, but it doesn't focus on the narrator's mental process or logical reasoning as much. Edgar Allan Poe had already written The Murders in the Rue Morgue in 1841, which cemented him as the inventor of detective fiction. But towards the end of his life, Edgar's fiction focused more on the concept and nature of death and murder in stories like The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar, Some Words with a Mummy, and The Cask of Amontillado. This story gave me a feeling that is very, very unique, something indescribable yet palpable. In order to try and capture this sensation, I tried to compose a hollow soundscape. Not empty, but hollow. I knew I wanted the score to reflect the emptiness that Mr. Wyatt would feel, and that meant less melodies and more pure sound in the composition. It was difficult combing through all of the different plugins that I have available in order to find the exact right sound, but I found some that were perfect for this story, like this. It really gives that hollow feeling that I was looking for. And as a funny oxymoron, the main character is filled with so much personality that I figured I had to have some kind of tune that played with his jumping back and forth, his playfulness, and especially the way that he saw and wanted to play with Mr. Wyatt. And it sounded like this. Those are just a few of the things that I consider when reading a story and creating original music for an episode. Now, there's an element present in this story that I don't think we should ignore. It's possible that the narrator of The Oblong Box carries romantic feelings for Cornelius Wyatt, based upon how he describes him and his relationship to the man. I rejoiced to see that the name of Mr. Cornelius Wyatt. I entertained feelings of warm friendship. He had been with me a fellow student. He had been with me a fellow student at university where we were very much together. He describes Wyatt as a genius with the truest heart which ever beat in a human bosom. It's rare that one would describe a friend, even a close one, with such devotion. And if you look at how bitterly the narrator describes the maid pretending to be Mrs. Wyatt, you read something that smells a lot like jealousy. If not positively ugly, she was not, I think, very far from it. I mean, come on, that is like a beautiful diss right there. The narrator seems to be more than just a curious friend, more than an old acquaintance. But this is just my theory. I understand it's not likely that Edgar Allan Poe, during the 19th century, in a mystery thriller story, would have intentionally written a character to be homosexual. But I've been reading some books by author Jonathan Ned Katz and Professor Michael Kimmel that go into the social changes that shaped American masculinity and relationships during the 19th century, as well as the many different ways to show an intimate connection between men without explicitly stating any homoerotic elements. But if we see the narrator as a potential lover, the narrator as a character adds to the central idea of this story, that holding on to grief can damage ourselves and our current or potential relationships. You have to admit that the gesture of Mr. Wyatt tying himself to the box and throwing himself to the sea is much darker than just romantic or tragic. It seems to be an action of madness, because why would anyone tie themselves to a heavy box and even attempt to swim? But in that juxtaposition, we have an intriguing thought. Holding on too tight to those we've lost can lead us to destroy our own lives. The escape boat is rowing away and the ship is literally sinking. Everything around Mr. Wyatt is screaming that he must let her go. But he returns to retrieve her body, and with no way out, he must go down with his decision. And let's be honest, if the escape boat had made its way back to the ship, he would have endangered the lives of all those survivors on board too. Holding on to our grief too tightly can eat us up. It can tear us apart. And what's pertinent is that Mr. Wyatt didn't share his burden with anyone else except the captain, and he tried to take it all on alone. And that's just impossible. If you follow this podcast on TikTok, then you know that I recently experienced a death in my family. And it's been very hard to deal with. It's one of the most humbling things to see someone you love taking their final breaths and wondering what did they want to do but not get to do? Where did they want to go and never get to go? I, for this person that I lost, am very angry. Life dealt this person a terrible hand, and they did the best they could with it, but I am angry. I am angry that this person was hurt, abandoned, and disrespected in the ways that they experienced, only to lead them to a bed where they slowly faded away. And every memory I have with this person flooded my brain as I saw them gradually slip under the veil of death. And I was assaulted by every emotion humanity has ever recorded. And I was unable to contain tears sometimes because despite all of that, I still saw this person as incomparably beautiful. And I shame myself for appreciating them and time with them the most only when I realize it's running out. Sorry, I don't mean to make this a therapy session, but I hope that if you have gone through loss like that, or if you are right now, or if you know you will soon, please know this. I'm with you. It sucks. Death sucks. Quote me on that. And it's okay to be angry, sad, regretful, enraged, and confused. Respect them and yourself enough to grieve fully. And then, within your own time, although it can be the hardest thing in the world to do, untie yourself from the box. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Poe Show, and please subscribe or follow on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, where I do reviews of Edgar Allan Poe film adaptations, and TikTok, where I make plenty of funny content about Edgar Allan Poe's works and life. Email the show at poeshowpod@gmail.com or send an anonymous text message to request a story. Some authors have submitted their stories to the podcast, so you can expect to hear a few original stories very soon. That's all for now, but I'll be here on the next episode of The Poe Show.